their vehicle and detonated explosives. The identities of the soldiers haven't been released. With more on the 43rd and 44th Canadian casualties in Afghanistan, here's CTV's Steve Chow.
The blast tore through billboards and a herd of camels. But Canadian soldiers were the ultimate target. Killed in the attack was the Canadian driver and crew commander of this Bison personnel carrier. Both were members of the Royal Canadian Regiment, based in Petawawa, Ontario.
At the current time, our thoughts and prayers are with the families back home in their moment of grief and with the members of the battle group who have lost some very close friends.
Increasingly, suicide bombings have become a favored tactic of insurgents. This year alone, there have been more than 100 in Afghanistan. But the military says such attacks fail to reflect the reality of the war, that NATO is in fact winning, and the general Afghan populace knows it.
There is the concern of suicide bombers, there is no doubt about that. But when you look at all things equally, life in Kandahar is much better now than it was 2 years ago, and it's certainly much better now than it was under the Taliban.
It has been 6 weeks since the death of a Canadian soldier. The pause raised hopes among troops that the oncoming winter would bring a welcome break to fighting here. This day's attack has dashed those hopes. Steve Chow, CTV News, Kandahar.
U.S. President George Bush is winging his way to Estonia. He'll stop there before carrying on to Latvia for the NATO summit. The president will be in Estonia for 1 day before heading to the Latvian capital, Riga. Estonia and Latvia have both sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, and the U.S. considers the two former Soviet republics important allies. At the NATO meeting, Bush is expected to press for a heavier financial and military commitment from many of the alliance's 26 members. After the meetings in Latvia, the president heads to Amman, Jordan, for 2 days of talks with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Scattered violence has been reported in Baghdad as a ban on traffic is lifted. The security clampdown was imposed after insurgents killed more than 200 people last week. Hundreds of mourners attended a memorial service for 10 civilians killed last night. They walked alongside minibuses loaded with coffins on their roofs. Mourners also gathered for the funerals of 3 people killed in a mortar attack on a Shiite mosque. And Iraqi militants blew up a police station in Burat, south of Bakuba. One of the militants was seen raising a flag belonging to the Mujahideen army. With more on the situation in Iraq, I'm joined by Samer Shehata. He's an assistant professor of Arab politics at Georgetown University in Washington. Now, Kofi Annan has just said that Iraq is nearly in a civil war, could fall into civil war unless urgent steps are taken to prevent this. First of all, what's your feeling about that?
I think the Secretary General is correct. I mean, over the last week, we've seen increased numbers of Iraqi civilian deaths. Clearly, it's been sectarian-inspired in Sadr city and then counterattacks on Sunni areas and mosques. So there's no question that things are getting worse and that it is sectarian in nature. So I think Mr. Annan is very correct.
All right, let's talk about this classified United States government report that has concluded that the insurgency in Iraq is now self-sustaining financially, in fact, doing very well, raising tens of millions of dollars a year from various things: oil smuggling, kidnapping, counterfeiting, and connivance by corrupt Islamic charities and various other crimes. How do we combat that?
Well, I think you've asked a very good question. I mean, it's very dire news, and it's not something that one can address easily. The only thing that it immediately leads itself to is strengthening the Iraqi state so that there is less corruption among officials and so on. If the analysis would have showed that, for example, the insurgency was getting large amounts of cash from banks in Syria or Jordan or something like that, it would be easier to address. But as the report states, it's very difficult to act, to operationalize this information.
So, well, is it a lack of security that enabled the insurgency to become self-sustaining financially?
I think that's very correct. I mean, there is an absence of a state, an absence of law and order, and this leads to organized crime, it leads to gangs, and it also allows the insurgency to undertake activities like kidnapping for ransom as a source of revenue, having those who engage in trade, shipments from Jordan and other countries pay money so that their convoys aren't attacked. And then, of course, the corruption that was mentioned in terms of smuggling oil and so on. So clearly the lack of law and order, the lack of a state allows or facilitates this kind of activity.
So is this all over Iraq, or is it localized?
I think it's mostly in Anbar and Diyala province, but nevertheless, and certainly not to the extent that we're seeing, it's not occurring to this extent in the Kurdish areas in the north, but certainly in central and also in southern Iraq, some of this activity is occurring.
So this looks more and more unwinnable, although some would say it's been unwinnable from the start. What should the U.S. do, in your opinion?
That's a very difficult question. I also think that the war is really lost already, and was lost, as you indicated, from shortly after the statue fell and the chaos that we saw in the first weeks. The United States can try to talk to some of the insurgents, try to increase the pressure on the Shia to make some concessions to the Sunnis. It can also include Iran and Syria, very importantly, in a dialogue about the future of Iraq. All of these things might be able to help the situation, but it's very, very dire.
Samer Shihata, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
You're welcome.
Ottawa is taking its international air policy in a new direction. It's called Blue Sky, and essentially it opens up the airways over Canada to more competition from foreign carriers. Transport Minister Lawrence Cannon says the Canadian traveller will benefit in the form of lower prices.
It means more choice and more opportunity to fly to the places they want to go. Canada's territory